I wanted to get an update on some geopolitics, and this is because it is all kicking off around the world and we're not really looking. We're not really paying as much attention, perhaps, as we should, to what's going on with Israel and Gaza. Israel has ordered residents of Khan Yunis now to evacuate ahead of an unprecedented attack launch. They've also begrudgingly, I have to say, begrudgingly begun to allow some aid into Gaza, but a minimal amount, even from their own words, from their own lips. Just enough. A little bit, a drop in the ocean of what is actually required by the people of Gaza, who are either starving to death, dying from all sorts of injuries, and not being able to go to hospitals, and in fact going to hospitals and being blown up. So, that is something we've got to look at. And also, President Trump said this afternoon that his long call with the Russian President Vladimir Putin was excellent. And that Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations towards a ceasefire. The trouble is that we know he's a bit in awe of Putin. So what did he agree? Zelensky's already told him, don't agree anything on our behalf. Ukraine has got to be at the table. We've got to be able to agree with this. Now, we know what Russia wants. Russia wants to get rid of Zelensky. They want a Russian government to take over Ukraine. They also want 5 areas of Ukraine. And they said then they'll start to talk about peace. So what was excellent about this call this afternoon? Well, hopefully with a few more details. Jamil, Jaffer, Executive Director at the National Security Institute at the George Mason University in Washington, D.C., joins me now. Jamil, let's kick off with that call between Putin and Trump. Any more details coming out?
Well, Petrie, what we do know for sure is that ultimately there was not an agreement to enter into a ceasefire coming off that call. We know the Ukrainians have been willing to, for a while, at least do a medium-term ceasefire. Putin has put on the table a couple of times a very short-term, a few days ceasefire. But there's been no real discussion of a long-term ceasefire. And if the goal of this call was to get him there, that doesn't appear to have succeeded. Now, he has gotten it back to the table, so that's a positive. But we'll see if that really results in anything. Remember, President Trump said that this war would be over not even the day after he joined office, but before he entered office. It's obviously we're now 5+ months in, and we still don't have a resolution to this conflict.
Well, J.D. Vance, speaking for the president, which I thought was extraordinary, mind you, nothing surprises me anymore, was saying, well, look, if it doesn't do if they don't do what Trump wants, then we're out. This is Biden's war.
Well, look, that is a new and interesting position that Vice President Vance has taken, in the sense that he's saying, look, if nobody's willing to come to the table, then we're going to walk away. Now, that is a problem, obviously, for Ukraine, because ultimately Ukraine relies on U.S. support. That being said, President Trump has made other points, right? He's suggested, additional sanctions might go into place, and thus far he has continued to support Ukraine at a lesser level, obviously. But he has also continued to press Russia. And so even though the Trump administration came in sort of tipped to be substantially in Putin's favor, with Putin not really being willing to negotiate or not doing enough, President Trump has tried to increase moderately, to be fair, the pressure on Putin, while also still trying to get him back to the table. So we'll see how this plays out. It would be obviously catastrophic for Ukraine if the U.S. were to walk away completely, and would only benefit Russia, which, we'll see if the Trump administration does that, but they haven't done that for the last 5 months.
But, Jamil, I mean, look, the first rule of negotiating, right, you don't show either side your hand, right, if you are the negotiator. J.D. Vance saying that ahead of talks, ahead of that phone call, you can bet your life that Putin saw it, and is now, all he's got to do is play this out. All he's got to do is kick the can down the road until the US gets bored with it, and then he's won. I mean, it's so basic. It is unbelievable. You wouldn't have to explain that to a 3-year-old.
No, you're exactly right, Petrie. If that's the play here, obviously, it's giving away all your leverage. If that's where the United States is, the challenge
It's
I think
unbelievable.
100%. The challenge I think for Vladimir Putin is Trump has suggested that before, but then he's actually changed course multiple times. He's actually gotten more aggressive against Russia. Again, only in a moderate way, not nearly where President Biden was, not nearly where some of the conservative Republicans want him to be on Ukraine. But he hasn't sort of given, the president could have easily walked away from Ukraine 100%. On day one, day two, and said, "Look, Vladimir, you deal with it, right? You want to take what you take, do it." People had him picked to do that, and he didn't actually do that. So, I do think the practice on the ground is a little different. I do think you're right that giving away all your negotiating leverage is a mistake, particularly for, as Trump likes to refer to himself, the greatest negotiator in history. He sort of did the same thing with TikTok. If you look at what happened there, where he said, "Look, I want America to buy TikTok. I want to get this deal done." But then his best piece of leverage, which was banning TikTok and blaming Congress for it because they're the ones who instituted the ban, he's held off on doing that. And he's given repeated 90-day extensions without any sort of end in sight, which don't even comport with the law. And of course, that puts him in a very difficult position because why would China negotiate at all if they know he's going to keep giving them extensions?
But yeah, I mean, you say he's been tougher on Russia. But only in rhetoric. I mean, he had levers he could pull, and he could have pulled them today. He could have got tough with Putin. He could have said, look, it's not enough that you send some of the lowest people in your administration to Turkey to insult Zelensky. That is not good enough. You were responsible for this war. You need to do it. Otherwise, there are sanctions. Instead, Trump comes out on Truth Social. He'd clearly been talking about trade deals with Russia. He wasn't for those 2 hours. He wasn't talking about peace deals. He was talking about trade. And it's very clear from his Truth Social. Oh, there's going to be great trade after this. We're going to trade with Russia. Russia's going to make a fortune. It's going to be great for everybody. Does he not know what that looks like? Or does he not care?
Look, there's no doubt that President Trump has a view that he can solve a lot of these problems with economics, that he can get better deals than anybody else, that he can win the sort of world game through the U.S.'s economic power. He tried that with tariffs around the globe. It didn't work. He had to pull back. He tried that with China. It worked a little bit, but he really didn't get a whole lot for the tariffs that were in place briefly. So, look, that approach is one he's trying. It's not working as effectively as I think he'd hoped it would work. Now he's trying it with Putin. He's trying the carrot version, which is you'll make a ton of money if you end this war and we can do trade with you. But unclear if it's going to work. It hasn't worked to date. And let's be honest, Vladimir Putin is fundamentally not a trustworthy person. He does not have America's interests at heart or at all. He only has Russia's interests at stake, which as the leader of Russia is where he should be. But President Trump thinks he can deal with him and get a good deal done. This is the challenge. He thinks he can do it with China. He thinks he can do it with Iran on a nuclear deal. And the reality is these, competitors are not just competitors, they're adversaries. And the sooner we start treating them like that, instead of like friends we can work with, I think probably the better off we are. We've seen this mistake, by the way, with Russia over and over again. President Obama made this mistake when he said to Putin, give me some more time after the election. President Bush, my old boss, made the mistake when he said, I looked into his soul and I saw something I can work with. President Trump has made this mistake before with Vladimir Putin. He's about to make it again. We'll see what happens.
I mean, a lot of people are suggesting it's difficult to read the outcome of the Putin-Trump call as anything other than a failure on Donald Trump's part. How can this be spun by Donald Trump as anything other than a US president who has failed in negotiation, diplomacy, and in the stewardship of this conflict? I mean, they are tough words.
I think the spin... Yeah, I mean, look, I think the spin from the White House is and will be, if we get to a deal now, right, if we get to a ceasefire, Ukraine and Russia get to a ceasefire in the next week or two, President Trump will almost certainly claim credit for that, saying, look, it was my initiative. I got Vladimir Putin back on board after he backed off multiple times. If they're at a ceasefire, then he can start talking about, end of conflict status negotiations. And if he can get there, then he can talk about the sanctions coming off and doing the trade deals that he's pitched in these calls. And so it's the way to spin it as a win. But of course, if Vladimir Putin continues to conduct attacks as he did when they were so close on the ceasefire negotiations earlier, attacking Kyiv brutally. It's not going to work. And Trump, showed frustration with Putin back a few weeks ago. He now thinks he's back in a good place. Remember, this is a president who thought he could do a nuclear deal with North Korea. That didn't work out. He thinks he's got a good trade deal with China. We'll see if that plays out. And he thinks he can push the rest of the world around, which hasn't worked yet thus far. It may work at times. We'll see. But, with Vladimir Putin, this is a guy who is fundamentally not trustworthy. President after president has made the mistake of thinking, I can work with Vladimir Putin. I can do deals with him. President Obama did substantively nothing about Vladimir Putin's first invasion of Ukraine, and look at where we ended up, a second invasion. And so, look, American presidents have failed time and time again when it comes to Russia. The only language they understand, and the only language Putin understands, is strength and power. And we'll see if he thinks Trump has that. It doesn't look like it right now because he's not giving in and trying to get a deal done.
I mean, we know what Putin wants, and I mentioned it just before I came to you. They want to get rid of the root causes of the conflict, right? Which we know is the removal of a democratically elected president, the installation of a Russian proxy government, as well as the incorporation of 5 Ukrainian regions into Russia. Now, what is in it for Ukraine to say yes to any single one of those things? I mean, there's never going to be a safe negotiation if that's what's on the table.
No, that's exactly right. And as a result, it's hard to see Ukraine making a deal. At the same time, Ukraine doesn't have a lot of options right now. If the Europeans could back this fight standing alone, they would. It's clear they cannot. And so without the U.S. supporting Ukraine, it's going to be very hard for them to gain any ground, much less, get to a better negotiating position than they're in today. So unfortunately for Ukraine, they're going to have to make some very costly concessions, which, again, with a brutal dictator and somebody who invades other countries like Vladimir Putin, all it's going to do is empower him.
Yeah.
He'll take these 5 provinces or whatever he gets, 3 provinces, 2, whatever he gets, and he won't be done with that. His ultimate goal is complete control of Ukraine, whether through a proxy or directly. I think you're exactly right. But then on top of it, his goal is to expand the Russian empire back beyond Ukraine to other parts of the former Soviet Union. Remember, he's a former KGB, FSB type officer who sort of hankers for the old USSR.
Yeah.
And the more we give him, we saw it in 2014 with Obama, you let him take Crimea, he's not done there. He's going to keep going. And I predict this will not be the end of it. We'll be back having this conversation in a couple of years from now. Petrie, whatever the deal gets done is, if it gives him anything, he'll want more later. He'll just use this time to rebuild his armed forces, get stronger, and come in tougher.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just before we finish up, I do want to talk about Israel. Trump has gone very quiet on relationships or relations with Benjamin Netanyahu. Has he got bored of that?
Well, Petrie, I'm not sure it's bored, but you did notice that President Trump was all over the Middle East in the last few weeks.
Yep.
He was in Qatar. He was in UAE. He was in Saudi. He met with the Syrian president, right, or the former Al Qaeda leader, I should note.
Yeah.
And he did not go to Israel. Very interesting decision by President Trump to not go to Israel. Now, obviously, President Trump has historically been a strong supporter of Israel. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government view President Trump as a strong supporter. But him not going to Israel is a signal, and it may suggest that in trying to do these deals with these other Arab governments, that there may be an effort here to try to bring the Gaza conflict to a close. The problem, of course, is in doing all that, President Trump did talk about Gaza and said, well, the U.S. is going to take it over, and we're going to solve for it. We're going to put people in good housing. Now, again, in the past when he said that, he meant remove those people from Gaza, put them in housing elsewhere, presumably in Jordan and Egypt, neither of which wants to take them. And of course, the idea that you're moving 2 million people out of their homes, it's unprecedented and almost certainly illegal under international law. Right, exactly. And so, we'll see how this thing plays out. But he did say that. And, look, the Israelis are getting a lot of funding and support and military support from the United States. They've now begun a new offensive there into Gaza. If the U.S. doesn't stand in the way of that, the offensive will continue. And so even without speaking, President Trump is supporting, I think, the Israeli government in this effort. And ultimately, that's what they're looking for.
But is he waiting? I mean, look, we know that the Abraham Accord, the Middle East wanted a two-state solution. What's happening in Israel at the moment, or in Gaza and Israel at the moment, and with the Trump, whatever the Costa del Trump or whatever he wants to call it, that is not a two-state solution. So is Donald Trump now realizing that, you know, he can get a Trump Tower in Saudi Arabia, he can get one in Syria, he can get a golf course in Qatar, you know, all of the, you know, those things. Is that going to sway him away from Israel?
Well, you know, who knows where the needle moves, but I guess what I will say about it is that President Trump has long been a supporter of Israel. They do have a right to bring the fight to Hamas and ultimately take Hamas out. The question is at what cost, and for them politically, and in the long term, what's the solution, right? What does a long-term end state for Israel and the Palestinians look like? Because at the end of the day, Israel doesn't want and can't survive a one-state solution either, because having the Palestinians in their state, it makes the Jewish character of that state impossible to keep. At the same time, Israel's a democracy, and having a group of people who don't have a democratic right in that country won't survive either. And so for Israel, too, a solution other than a one-state solution is something they need to identify. The question is right now, how do you get there? And there's no clear path to that going forward as of right now. I was just in Israel at the end of December. It was the bleakest I've seen it, both on the Israeli side and the Palestinians. Nobody sees a path forward right now. And that's what makes this situation really difficult, Petrie. But
Trump has emboldened Netanyahu to continue basically leveling Gaza, and you know, using Hamas and pushing people further away. And they're now talking about creating a safe zone in Gaza that will be Israeli controlled. That sounds to me like they've already started the process of clearing out that whole region.
Well, Petrie, look, I don't think the Israelis think they can clear out the region or really establish a long-term presence in Gaza outside of at the perimeter on the borders, right? You remember, the Israelis have been in Gaza before. They've occupied it before. They had settlements. They made the voluntary decision to pull out, remove their settlers at some significant cost to the Israeli government itself, physically using its own military to remove its own people in order to get out of Gaza. I don't think they have any desire to go back in there other than to create a sort of, you know, what you might call a demilitarized zone on the border to prevent attacks like what we saw. Again, could be proven wrong, but I doubt they want to reoccupy any part of Gaza. Then the question becomes, once you have that sort of border zone, what happens next? That's the million-dollar question that nobody has an answer to.
Yeah.
And as far as leveling Gaza goes, look, if Israel wanted to really level Gaza tomorrow and kill millions, they could. They're not doing that, right? The reality is that while the civilian death toll is horrific and way more than anybody would want, right, they are trying to prosecute a war against Hamas. And the truth is, every civilian that dies in that conflict, every woman or child that dies in that conflict, does not benefit Israel. It harms them, makes it hard for them to fight the war, because the international community, you know, goes against them. And if you look at it, the real beneficiary of civilians dying in Gaza is Hamas. And so you wonder why they're putting civilians in harm's way. It's because unlike a typical government, Hamas doesn't want to save their own civilians. They actually want to put them at risk, taking the view that in the long term, that's going to benefit them. And that's the real problem with a group like Hamas.
Jamil, it's fascinating as ever to talk to you. Thank you so much for giving me the time today. I know you were busy. Jamil Jaffer there, Executive Director at the National Security Institute at George Mason University in Washington, D.C.